It's a really interesting experience. Which I would recommend everyone try if they can. It makes use of similar approaches that Square Enix is closer to kind of like it has this kind of almost like a film, a movie type experience. You're in a fixed spot and you can kind of go closer and inch towards the characters a little. There are animated sequences and whatnot. And that's kind of the approach. And then there's one we created at GML, which I will now open the video. Can anyone see the video? Or do I have to adjust the screen sharing?
Right now it's looking black. Is there a YouTube link you could actually share? Is it hosted on YouTube?
I can actually.
Perfect.
So I'll just share YouTube video. Just give me 1 little second. There we go. So that's. I'll just turn off the volume here. But this is the one we created at the BGML. This with a bunch of really talented Emily Carr students across different disciplines. And our approach here was a little different from everything I've mentioned previously. It was less about giving a kind of experience where you're simply just watching the content versus being able to inhabit the scenes and kind of explore them. That was a lot of that was kind of what drove the approach we did with this kind of content, and it brought up it created a lot of interesting like opportunities for storytelling within the medium, and I'll kind of run through one of them. One of the examples I think was really effective that the medium kind of allowed us to do. So switch back. Now presenting live is hard. Okay. So can everybody see the PDF?
I think we still see the stream.
Okay.
Paused.
Okay. And share YouTube.
You click on the 3 dots and then go up to share. Okay, here we go. We're back at the PDF now.
Great. Okay, so this is a bunch of stills from a sequence in Damien Failing comic that we premiered at VIF last year, and I'm just going to kind of run through the scene really quickly. So this is one of our protagonists here, Phalian. She is kind of a mercenary type character, takes on jobs and just a lot of illegal things. And in this sequence, it's kind of like any heist movie. She kind of breaks into this facility, quickly knocks out the 2 scientists sitting there, and begins kind of hacking the files and stealing that. It's nothing you haven't really seen before. But here's the interesting thing about doing this as a VR graphic novel, is that because you are in control of how the pacing of the story goes. So the player can always kind of move forward and backward in time whenever they want. So what you can actually do is you can actually rewind time to before Phalian walked in to the scene, and you can see that the 2 scientists are having kind of a conversation before that. And normally in a film, you would just see her knock out the characters, and that'll be the end of that. But within this medium, we kind of have more time to flesh out who these characters are and what their whole story is. So just sets tone of what's happening is they're having a conversation about the scientist on the left who's just learned that his son has some kind of genetic disease, and he's kind of confused because neither him nor his wife are carriers. That's the conversation that's happening here. And you can actually look around and inspect further into the scene and kind of notice a lot of things. For example, this is a photo of the scientist, again, on the left here, and his wife and son. And you might notice something, that his son shares very few features with his wife or him, but in fact actually resembles his coworker a lot here. And this is kind of almost like a little mystery that we kind of hid within the scene. It's not something that the experience itself would direct you to. It would kind of just hint at it through just details. And if you do look further ahead, you might be able to find a discarded letter in the washroom nearby where his coworker all but admits to being his his son's illegitimate father. And there are all these little subtle hints there in the story that kind of allow for us to create these little narrative moments that just recontextualize the whole scene. Because now when Phalion over here knocks these two guards out, you kind of have different emotions about what's going on here versus them just being fodder for our main characters to attack. But creating this kind of content did come with its fair share of challenges and taught me a bunch of lessons along the way. So I'm going to kind of delve into a few things I learned. And the first thing would be accessibility is everything. And it's very easy to forget, like when you're working in VR for a long time, that this is new technology to most people, because we try to make this experience for the casual kind of person. Gamers, people, we've had a lot of good success with putting gamers through VR graphic novels, but whenever we put more casual viewers into it, we kind of came into issues. Because I know everybody probably knows this movie, Ready Player One. This is kind of, I think, what most people outside this sphere kind of assume VR is like, which is not completely accurate. It's a lot clunkier than this. And some very basic things are harder for them to comprehend because they're not used to the controls nor the kind of rules of VR and all that stuff. And it's easy to kind of forget that when you're designing your experiences. For example, in one of our earlier graphic novels we made, we had a fairly simple tutorial because we assumed it's a comic. It needs to be like, somebody doesn't need to teach you how to read a comic. You kind of just read it. So we thought, we assumed that the interface we may design the interface to be very simple. And we assumed it wouldn't really need people too much time to kind of explain. We had this little character over here who would kind of just tell you what to do in terms of what the buttons do, let you play around with them, and then kind of let you roam free. But this proved like this proved that, like, when we put people through it, we actually learned that a lot of people, like, this wasn't enough for some people, because something as simple as teleporting, which is the main way you move around in VR experiences, was foreign to them, and we had to kind of actually take the time to properly establish a lot of things. So this led to us kind of redesigning a lot of the ways that we taught people how to do this, especially if they're doing this for the first time in VR, because for a lot of people it was their first time in VR, and we wanted to make sure that they had an experience that wasn't kind of stressful. It was very easy to jump in and out. So that's why in VIF Immersed, by the time we presented the graphic novel, which appeared as both a VR graphic novel and a 360 animated film, we also created a 2D version, as you can see here, so that people who are more averse to VR or couldn't easily get the controls could still kind of experience the story on some level, and on a much easier way to do it, so that across the board, whether or not you were tech savvy or not, you could still engage with the story on some level and then potentially go in if you needed. Sorry, was that? Did somebody say something?
Did somebody have a question?
Sorry, that was me accidentally unmuting myself.
No worries. It's all good.
Okay. And on to the second thing I learned. People do not like reading in VR. This is a rather unfortunate thing to learn when you're making a graphic novel in VR, but it happens. I've learned painfully that a lot of people don't enjoy the process of reading in VR. I attribute it to generally being that a lot of people kind of get into VR has this kind of connotation with gaming, so people expect to be more active and kind of it's kind of a place where you expect to be able to turn your brain off mostly. So reading and being a graphic novel being something that's so reading heavy wasn't something that was very successful, because a lot of people just hated the idea that they'd have to kind of really pay attention to the words and all that stuff. It was a very tricky thing to design around. So I can give you an example of why that was hard within the context of our project. So here, this is a storyboard for the first scene in the graphic novel, in the Damien Failing graphic novel, and on paper you can kind of run through this really quickly. It's like something you can get into maybe 1 or 2 minutes. You've read all the dialogue here, and you've kind of understood what happens. But when you translate that into VR, this sequence becomes an actual physical or virtual space, a 3D space that the player is inhabiting. So they're not just a disembodied camera, they're actually inside the space as all this is happening. And we designed, for example, these are our protagonists, and this is their spaceship. This is kind of the way they live their day to day. And we designed it to be this kind of small, cozy space that kind of isn't too big. We kind of wanted to get this idea that they're kind of almost like bunkmates. They're kind of stuck together in this confined space and kind of have to learn to deal with each other. And thematically, it worked very nicely, but in practice, this ended up being a rather confined space for you to inhabit with these two characters who are already taking up almost as much room as you are. And when you're doing this many panels, which is about 12 panels, or 13 if you count this one, it ends up being like, it starts being this feeling, you start getting this feeling of linear progression, like that you do when you're flipping over a page, and it starts to feel kind of like you're cramped, because all that's changing as you go from panel to panel is the character's movements. So you're essentially standing in one place for 11 panels worth of dialogue, and the characters are just moving, and that's all that's changing. You kind of feel enclosed, and all you're doing is reading. So we learned to kind of this was a problem we kind of encountered early on, and we kind of tried to design around that. One of the ways we did that was we tried to limit our dialogue. Of course, that's the first kind of solution. Limiting our dialogue and trying to establish as many things as possible visually helped to kind of reduce the load in terms of people having to read too much. Dialogues are mostly used to kind of speed the plot along or to kind of suggest character traits. And another thing we did was, so this comic, the one we did for Damien Failing, the traditional comics that DC and Marvel kind of release every week are about 22 pages. So we kind of wrote this to be about 22 pages, but we realized 22 pages in VR is quite a lot. So what we did is we kind of shortened the comic part of the story to 8 pages, and we presented the second half of the comic as a 360 animated sequence. So what happens is, as you're reading the comic in VR, walking around the space, when you get to the halfway point, after you've read a certain amount, it switches to the second part of the comic, where it's just a 3-minute animated short that exists both in 360 and in 2D, depending on how you're viewing the comic. And this kind of allowed people it was kind of like a relief for some people, because apart from the fact that a lot of people weren't expecting this to go into a 360 animated video halfway through, it also allowed them to kind of turn off their brain for a little bit, because the second half of the film was essentially like this roller coaster ride. So you've read all of this, you've gotten all this information that you need for the narrative to make sense, and all that's left is for you to turn off your brain and kind of go with the flow. So this kind of helped to solve that problem a little bit. And number 3 was world building is a rabbit hole. So anyone who knows me would know I'm completely obsessed with world building. I truly enjoy the process of kind of fleshing out fictional locations and figuring out how life exists within them. And for this project, there was a very extensive effort to make our worlds feel lived in, because a big part of the experience was exploration and learning about these worlds. And we wanted to make sure that there was enough thought out so that you didn't feel like we just kind of jury-rigged them. In order to do that, we ended up writing these very extensive documents that kind of explain a lot about the thing. This helped internally so that concept artists and writers would be able to easily be on the same page, but also helped kind of frame everything we put into the world. It made things a lot easier. For example, this is a case in point for like this is what you're looking at here is a vertical city that we used for actually just one scene, but we ended up doing all of this work because we thought it would help flesh out the environment. And while that worked, the problem was we did so much of fleshing out for this world that it couldn't, like, we needed to justify the amount of work we did because we only use it for one scene, and the work we did, like the level of thought we put into the environments, we gave the city its own history, its own dynamics, and it got to the point where we got attached to the characters, and we ended up actually making all of these characters and dynamics enough to actually make a separate whole story for them. And and while that's good, because to the point, this is actually it'll take too long to pull it up, so I'll just avoid that for now. But this is like, there's actually a full storyboarded sequence for a story set in this entire vertical city that's kind of just that actually shows up in one scene in our actual story. And this is kind of just a testament to the dangers of being overzealous with your world building, because I had a lot of the way we set up our team was we had different writers kind of focus on different parts of the world, and we ended up creating so much content and so many stories and characters that we found ourselves getting less and less interested in the main thing we were making, and more about building on these other worlds that we've kind of fleshed out. So yeah, that's kind of the main thing, and you can see it here in that we did the same thing applies for all of our scenes. But the reason why this scene here is a little better than what I described for the last one is because this scene, every little element here that's outlined here is more about building. Like the details that are presented here are less about fleshing out and expanding the world, but they're more about telling you things about the character that lives here. So all the items here all kind of contribute to your understanding of who the person who owns this room is. And that's an example of how to better make use of world building versus spending so much time fleshing out a world. Because the problem with fleshing out a world too much is you end up just distracting your story, and everything you put in your environment should help your story be told even better versus detract from it. So that's the whole thing about world building. And then curiosity is a double-edged sword. So what that means is curiosity is probably the thing that makes this graphic novel work so well. For example, we had the little feature here that we called the cipher. It was kind of this glowing ball kind of object that you could summon just by holding down the grip buttons on the VR Oculus controller. And once you had it summoned, all you had to do was throw it at an object or something in the world, and this object the cipher would kind of reveal something about it. It would tell you more about the world. In this case here, it's translating alien text into English so you can kind of understand what it means. And this ended up being the most successful part of the entire experience, because what would happen is people would go in after they read the comic for a little bit, they'd step into the scenes, and then the moment they've learned they could use this cipher ability, their engagement just kind of skyrocketed. They would be throwing this thing everywhere, trying to figure out what everything is in the room. And that was really good because it would extend playtime drastically. It would make people more active. It kind of added that sense of, it justified you being able to enter the scenes for the comic. But what it also did is it made us actually there's no YouTube link for this one, so I think I'll just kind of sum up what I was going to do in another way. But yeah, the issue with having this ability to kind of find more things in the environment is there's almost no there's no bedrock. There's no point where the user doesn't stop asking questions with curiosity. For example, this is just the character screen in one of the scenes that we made, but we actually had to go in and make an actual computer screen and fill it with some logical files that would relate to what the character's job is, and also blur out a bunch of items so we didn't have any copyright issues and things like that, because we had players who would constantly look at the individual icons on the screen and figure out what the character was doing. And we had this problem across the board. Every single scene kind of had all these little elements that were not essential to the overall experience, but were things that could incite curiosity, and we had to kind of cover all those avenues. So it's about like, so I slowly had to kind of learn that it's important to make sure that if you want to manage people's curiosity and make sure that you don't have to create a billion stories and or assets to like fill up all of the, like to make sure that whenever the player throws the cipher at an object, they have a like satisfying reward. You have to kind of add a sense of hierarchy to the objects in your scene and make sure that you design things in a way that some objects are more interesting or alluring than others, or some elements in this require more scrutiny than others, because VR kind of allows this level of focus and clarity in virtual environments that no other medium has, because you're seeing it from a one-to-one level. Textures have to be much higher resolution, or objects need to kind of be completely made in 3D with no like, and all the seams need to be hidden, because it's not a third person controller, it's the person's eyesight. You actually need to make sure that when they inspect an object up close, it holds up. So what we learned was it was better to kind of prioritize certain objects over others, so that players wouldn't bother looking at, oh, what is that chair, or what is this thing, and focus on some weird looking alien artifact in the corner, because that's the thing that actually requires you to question what it is. And this example here is a billboard that this is an example of us going a bit too far, because this is a billboard that we made for one of our scenes, and this isn't just random scribbles. We actually we actually made an alphabet in an alien language. So all of these are actual words. They read out real things, and there's an actual logic to how the writing works. We didn't just draw random symbols. And in hindsight, we really didn't need to do that. We just assumed that people would pay attention to these, and 1 in 10 people would really take the time to see if this stuff makes sense. But for the larger percentage of people in the experience, this stuff doesn't really matter all that much. So it's about kind of choosing and picking where you should put this level of detail and focus, and letting everything else kind of be less fleshed out. And I think the final most important lesson I learned was prioritizing agency and fun over anything else. Because, and this kind of goes into something I'll discuss further down the line, but whenever you're creating an experience, you kind of have a way in your mind that you want your players to kind of go through it. And that's kind of not a good, I've learned it's not the best approach to design things for, because you should kind of be the other way around. People will kind of never do what you plan for them to do whenever it comes to experiences where they have a choice. So it's always better to make sure that you've designed your experience in a way that helps them do what they want to do, versus versus one that urges them to kind of lean in a certain direction. For example, I'm the kind of person who, if reading or playing a video game, I will explore every single thing apart from the main thrust of the narrative, because I'm very curious. I want to see how much the developers have put into the world. Some people want to just narrow their focus and just kind of go in the straight direction, and that's okay too. While some people do the opposite. And something was a mistake. There's something I still regret doing, and that was during VIF. We actually locked the ability to step into the graphic novel panels until you had read the whole story through, because we kept having this issue where people would kind of step in and lose the main story because they were so busy exploring and looking at other things. So we wanted to ensure that you understood the story from the start to finish before you kind of went to explore. And I regret doing that, because whether or not people, in the playtest anyway, whether or not they knew the main story, people had fun. And I can say this is a room full of people who tested out the experience for us briefly in Emily Carr, and I can say that all of these people cannot tell me what the main characters' names are, ironically, given that they're the title, but they did leave having fun and remembering their own personal experiences of looking under this table or finding all these little things. And I think that is ultimately more valuable than trying to get people through this rigid experience. I think the best approach to this is just making sure that the people experiencing your VR graphic novel are the one, they kind of leave with some experience that's profound to them, whether or not it's the exact way you envisioned it. And this is supposed to be a video, but I just wanted to just say, yeah, so ultimately, the VR graphic novels we made ended up being flawed, as most things are, but I kind of ended up being, we did learn a lot about this kind of work in terms of making and developing virtual worlds and experiences, and kind of creating places that you would want to actually spend time in, because that was the one kind of thing we almost got universally praised for, was people loved the environments and worlds we built, and they really felt alive and lived in. So where to next? So there's kind of, I was going to circle back to a video of the cipher again here, but
does the video just not play if you try to play it?
This is because this is a PDF. Unfortunately, all the videos are kind of like
right. Okay.
It'll just take too long to kind of find each one. I'd rather not go through that. But basically, what I was there, kind of was, I found out. I realized later, once after we finished the 2 graphic novels, that there was kind of a bit of a fundamental design issue with the way we approach it. We had this linear story, and we also had exploration. We kind of built 2 different experiences and sandwiched them together. And it's something that kind of irked me with playtesting, because people would almost, you either got people who explored a lot, or you got people who just read the main story, but you're never able to please both groups at the same time. So something I wanted to investigate and figure out why that was. And I realized it's because I kept trying to tell a traditional story in a non-traditional medium, because VR is a medium that kind of has more freedom than pretty much anything else I've ever experienced. Because with film, and even to some extent game, most games anyway will kind of put you in are very directed about, like, they're designed around your, like, the director's kind of vision. They want you to go down a certain path most of the time. But when you come into VR and a lot of experiences that are a bit more open-ended, they kind of leave you feeling like you are in control of where your journey goes. And an example of that is The Outer Wilds. The Outer Wilds is it's a space exploration video game where the entire game is all about just your own curiosity. You wake up and you're this astronaut who kind of all you know is you're in a world and there's like a time loop, and there's a bunch of, you're in a kind of small solar system. There's a time loop where the sun is going to explode in about 20 minutes, and all you're allowed to do is just explore and go to any of the planets and learn more about the solar system before the sun explodes each time. And the further you like explore, the more stuff you find about the history of the world, and kind of figure out why you are where you are within the narrative. And I thought that was a really interesting approach, because it's a non-linear story. It has a beginning, middle, and end, but it was designed in a way that it's based on what the player chooses to look for and where they go, versus having a Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 plot as you see in a movie. And it brought my attention to things like paintings like this. This is an ancient Chinese painting that I read about in class, and it's kind of one of the only examples of work, one of the few examples I've seen of kind of work that doesn't have a clear focal point. This painting is kind of about everything that's in it. I don't think there's no one object here that takes precedence over the other, really, because it's more like the world that's in focus versus one clear thing. And I really like this concept of having a world be the center of your story versus one element inside it. And I wanted to explore that. So I ended up with something I'm still exploring and developing in my spare time currently. And I will be pulling that up now. Unfortunately, I do not have it up on YouTube, so I will just have to share my screen to show you the video. But it's a very experimental thing I'm testing, based on the architecture of the VR graphic novel. Can everyone see the, I'm going to just kind of not share my screen and share it again. There we go. Can everyone see the video?
Yeah.
Okay. So,
You can see the video player. So let's see how smoothly it plays. Yeah, just so folks know, it might be a bit stuttery, but we'll get the general idea. So
yeah, so this is just a short little video that I've used to kind of previs this concept. And it's just this idea that you create an environment or world or location, and the idea is to just let the player loose within this location and see what kind of stories are unfolding here, and just see how they all interconnect, and maybe be able to piece the history of it and how it all ties together. Because we tend to, within linear narratives, we tend to kind of condense the chaos that the real world is. There's a bunch of things happening all at the same time. There's a bunch of, it's very chaotic. It's very kind of uncontrollable. And this idea of being able to inhabit a world that, and kind of choose where you want to go, but also by exploring it and answering the questions you have about this world, you kind of chart out the logic of the world by yourself. So it's kind of a narrative set within a world that only kind of constructs itself based on whatever the player or the audience is focusing on. And that's the kind of thing I've been exploring based on the feedback we've gotten from the exploration aspects of the graphic novels. It's something I hope to really push and see how far I can take it, because to this day I don't see a lot of content, especially within VR, that tries to tell non-traditional stories. Because I've seen a lot of films that are essentially regular films, but within the context of room scale, where you can inch closer towards the characters, but not really changing the formula in any meaningful way. So that's currently where I'm at, and just like to open up the PDF one more time. And yeah, thank you for listening. Yeah.
Nice.
very nice. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I think someone just raised their hand, actually.
Okay. Go ahead.
Oh, maybe they did it by accident.
Okay, no worries.
Oh yeah, I did it by accident. But anyways, I did have a question. Like I saw some trees in your video. How did you make those?
In the video, the trees are entirely made in Quill. These are all just kind of quickly drawn and thrown together in Quill, purely for they're very low poly, and a little bit of optimization was done in Blender to kind of make sure they ran well, but they're all entirely done in Quill with a custom shader that I've been developing recently to kind of generate lighting, because Quill uses unlit shaders on its base level. So I've been experimenting in Unity to create a shader that naturally accepts light despite all the issues of unclean mesh that Quill has. So yeah.
Yeah, actually, could you tell us all the different tools that you ended up using? Did you use like Mixamo, for example?
Yes. So for this video and the VR graphic novels, we used Quill, which is just for those who don't know, it's a VR painting and animation tool. We also used Unity, which is a game engine. And then we also use Mixamo for occasional, like I've recently started using Mixamo just to kind of previs a lot of elements, and also kind of Mixamo is a very useful resource because you can quickly rig characters, no matter how bad your geometry is.
Yeah.
And use them to kind of populate scenes, especially mostly for there's a tendency to kind of just prioritize the things that are essential for your experience, and anything that's not essential, you can kind of quickly just use Mixamo to fill in the details. You need to see cars driving by or people walking by the street, so Mixamo is a good way to get things like that out of the way really quickly and then focus on doing the important things for your experience.
So in Damien Fallion, did you, or was it more just posed characters that would just kind of fade from pose to pose, but they were kind of
yes.
in a frozen state?
Yes,
And
for Damien Fallion, they were entirely frozen
Yeah.
for the duration of it, because at the time, Quill hadn't gotten to the level where you could basically do animation.
Mm.
So real-time animation in Quill wasn't, at least with fairly complex models and complex-looking characters, it wasn't something that we were capable of doing until sometime, and it was until about, I think, November 2019. That's essentially where that kind of sprouted from, because the graphic novel was the kind of only way to do that, to allow you to explore scenes and have characters in there in real time, because if these models were to move, the computer would not be able to handle it. So we kind of doubled down on the idea that they were frozen in this state, and graphic novels were kind of the perfect medium, because graphic novels by nature are still images. But then as soon as animation in real time with Quill was viable, then I think that's kind of when the explorations into new things started, because if these characters are moving, it changes the way you kind of interact with them, because normally it's just a matter of stepping in and kind of looking at them because they're not going anywhere. But when they're moving, you kind of have to change how you approach everything.
Yeah, for sure.
Just a couple questions in chat here. Could you just briefly explain what Mixamo is for those who aren't familiar?
Right. Okay. Mixamo is it's an Adobe web app that allows you to upload 3D models, humanoid characters usually, and kind of auto rig them for 3D animation. So if you want to, let's say you wanted to quickly set up a character for like a I don't know, a dungeon crawler video game, you could quickly model them in any software you like, whether it's, I don't know, ZBrush or Maya or Blender, and upload it to Mixamo, which would automatically rig it for you and then apply animations to the rig, so you don't have to do all of that work yourself from the ground up. Yeah.
I'm old enough to remember a software called Poser back in the day, which is like a everything else in the early 2000s. And that would basically allow you to, just have like a default humanoid character, and then it would auto rig it. And then it would have these, different animation walk cycles that you could apply, and you could change parameters. You could have them walk sexier, lazier, faster, more athletic, more clumsy, and then the limbs would start bashing into each other. And of course, there was always like the frog walk that you could have people do if you wanted to. So I feel like that was kind of like the spiritual precursor to what Mixamo can do now. I'm sure they've come a long way since then. But did it help you? Was it like a good shortcut for you when you needed to just iterate and get something out quickly, and you didn't have to worry too much about complex interactions that you'd have to hand animate?
Oh yeah, especially recently in the past few short films I've been working on, I've made use of Mixamo quite heavily, because when you're making short films with basically one or two people, you really don't have time to polish a lot of things. So Mixamo is a really useful way to just prioritize certain things. I tend to just, there's almost this kind of feeling of, you didn't animate that, so you shouldn't use it. So I tend to put those things in the rear background. So there's not this feeling of I'm just using Mixamo to kind of solve my problems, and just have those things only be kind of ancillary. But it does help, especially for prototyping. It's an extremely useful tool, I would say.
Nice.
Like I could also say the same thing for Quill, which is a good way to get. Quill isn't something I would suggest after spending a year using it to make full applications. I would not suggest making an entire application using Quill. It has a tendency to generate extremely heavy models, and most of your time will be spent just working around that. So I would not suggest using Quill, but for pre-visualizing or for testing, if you really wanted to see how your application would feel, you could very quickly, with one artist, figure out what your scene is going to look like, just in terms of getting the general volumes and mood with Quill, and test that out, and then finally start replacing them with the final assets, which is often what we did. We would mock them up in Quill, and then whenever we found spots that basically were things like the environments, right? Our environments were things that needed to be fairly lightweight because our characters were really detailed. So we would mock up the environments in Quill first, place in our characters, and when we started having optimization issues, we'd slowly just swap out parts of the environments with cleaned up models until we got to a point where the application could run at a decent rate, and then we start to kind of just be very specific about what we put in with Quill and what we don't.
Nice. Let's see if we got another question here. We have a question. What inspires you to create your work?
That's a good one. I guess I can't really help it. For me, it's more of like I get bored if I'm not doing anything else. I'm extremely bad at mundane, like everyday tasks. Very, very bad. And so creating is almost like just breathing. It's just something I need to do or I will explode in that way. And for me, it's all about trying things that haven't really been tried before, or I haven't tried before. Because I feel like anyone can kind of do something that's already been done really well and it will be impressive. But there's this sense of, I don't know, there's this sense of pride you get when you're able to, when you know you're trying something that may not work, but if it does, it'll be really cool to know that it's possible. It's just this idea of increasing the knowledge that everybody has. Like there's a lot of things I learned about making a VR graphic novel that probably aren't useful to a lot of people, but just knowing that if somebody were to start trying to make one themselves, they like a bunch of the questions have already been answered for them is kind of a really comforting thought, especially in this line of work. Because with VR, VR is still being reinvented almost every day. So always being able to contribute something to it is a really good feeling.
Were there any lessons that you learned just in VR in general and around the tech with the headset and things like that people have experienced in other VR experiences, like dizziness or the screen door effect or, disorientation? Can you maybe talk us through a bit of those challenges too?
Oh yeah, so VR is notorious for making people feel sick. Motion sickness is a huge thing. So I've learned that a lot of things that could really help solve those issues is kind of, for one, the main thing I've learned is focus, because my background is in animation and film. So I think I've made more 360 animated films than I have made anything else. And what I've learned is if you always have a clear thing to focus on, something that kind of drives the camera movement and all that, people find it a lot easier to stabilize themselves with. For example, the short film we put in VIF it's a bit of a roller coaster ride. The camera is constantly moving and running in all sorts of directions, and the way we got around doing that without making people throw up in the headset was we made sure that the camera never moved unless our characters were moving in that direction. And we also found it smart to occasionally stop and kind of give reasons for them to pause. The characters would run a little bit and pause in the location for a certain amount of time, catching their breath. So it's almost putting you and the characters in the same kind of headspace. So when you move, you're both prepared for it. And we also try to make sure that the movement was always linear. So you don't go in a straight line and then suddenly start going diagonally. You kind of have to go in a straight line, stop, and then pick another direction that the characters are moving before you go. And there's also things like embodiment, right? If, especially in a real-time VR experience, it helps people, like people knowing that they have some, what's the word, representation of themselves within a virtual world, whether or not it's fully accurate. You don't need like actual realistic hands or something like that to make people feel like they have a presence. It's more about how, like when they're holding the controls, what their hands look like, or if their motion has any effect. Like with the cipher, the thing you summon to kind of explore around, we have this trail effect that we put around it. So whenever you're holding it and moving your hand around, it's the trail is kind of signing your movement almost, and it helped a lot of people. Like it helped a lot of people ground themselves, because having this thing that seems to have some degree of effect on the world makes you feel like you're really there, and it makes you it kind of, the parts of your body or biology that are telling you that what you're seeing isn't real kind of tend to get overridden by those kind of moments. So that's been my experience with that kind of idea.
Nice.
Um,
Go ahead.
Question, if we still have time.
Yeah, absolutely.
I didn't hear you talk much about sound design, but could you talk about if there was any ambient like sound, background sound consideration in design?
Yes. Okay. We did have sound design within the experience. Sound design is like the one thing I am absolutely useless at. So I can't speak too loudly about really great techniques for doing that, but I do know what we did. Our approach with this is we had about 2 or 3 sound designers on this project, and we played a lot with 2 things: spatialized sound and we all occasionally try to spatialize music as well. So what we did is we didn't have any dialogue for the characters, mostly because it's very hard to find Nigerian women in Vancouver, but also it was just to kind of stay true to the nature of a comic and make sure that, because I wanted to make sure that people were controlling the whole thing at their own pace. So having dialogue would kind of disrupt that. So we made sure so all the character dialogue, all the character acting was limited. There was basically no voice acting. But what we did is we filled up the other sounds. So if there was a cash register in the distance, you'd be able to hear the sound. If there's a coffee machine, you'd be able to hear the sound when you go up close. If a character did a certain action on a pose, for example, they slammed their fist on the table, when you flip to that next panel, the panel would open with that sound of fist, and then it would not play again.
Mm.
But if you rewound and then play the panel again, it would. But it's kind of like we kind of have to separate our sounds into sounds that are ambient and loop around, and then sounds that are one time and very sequential. So it was this balancing act of like making sure that you knew when a character did a distinct motion, because you kind of really had to be very select about which motions had sound, and also making sure we had sounds that we had sounds that were very distinct from when you, the player, were doing something and when the characters were doing something. Because you throwing, like, the issue with something like VR is, especially when everything kind of looks the same, especially with a strong art style, you need to kind of be able to clearly distinguish things. Yeah, and we did some of that visually. For example, anything that was related to the player, anything that was extra diegetic or related to the player, we tried to kind of use this. We had this aesthetic of like this kind of cold white color, even for the design of the cipher, that would tell you that this is something that's not actually in the scene. It's more built for you to interact with, or it's something that relates to your role as the kind of explorer here. And with the sound, the sound artists developed this kind of, I don't know, ephemeral feel to any of the emotions that are related to that. There are all these trumpet sounds and these kind of more, I don't know how to describe them, almost abstract sounds that would be relayed to whenever you did something, as whenever you step into a new scene or entered a portal or things like that. You'd have all these sounds that were kind of in the same family, this otherworldly family of sound bites, while everything else was kind of inherently mundane. You'd be hearing, people just chattering in the background, cars driving by, music from like the radio station, all those little things. and we try to do a hard contrast with those two. But in general, our scenes would have ambient tracks that would essentially loop around, and then these specific tracks that were glued to certain panels. So you have sound that's basically limited to a certain action, and then you have sound that's for the entire environment all at once.
Well, that was a good question, Mimi. And it's funny because I think we have David Storin on the call, potentially. We had some wonderful speakers in our previous meetup, and they did a virtual reality experience that was pretty much all based on kind of reactive sound components in this wonderful soundscape in this fictional world called Naona. And so, of course, it would be interesting if there was some collaboration possibility there, because I'm sure they could compose some wonderful interactive soundscapes for to complement your visual experience, you know?
That would be amazing. Like, sound is probably the most effective part of all of this. There's something about sound that grounds, I think.
I've also heard that sound is good at directing the viewer to attention, aside from just like a glowing object or one of a certain color. It's kind of like, especially the spatial audio says there's something interesting this way, which piques their curiosity, right? So that could be a good tool. We have a question from Brady as well. Do you think audio dialogue would be harder or easier to design interaction for than text dialogue? So I'm guessing what she means is as opposed to the audio recording instead of just like a pop-up bubble.
That's a good question. It depends. I think it really depends on what the nature of the interaction is. For example, with the VR graphic novel, because the player was in control of time, that's when it becomes trickier, because the issue of being in control of time is an audio clip or a performance is something that's beholden to time. You can't really have a good performance if time is variable. So if our characters were speaking in real time with you, it would be a little trickier to basically allow the sound, because what would happen is you'd press your trigger and then the soundbite would play, the character would do the animation and talk, and then they'd kind of stop awkwardly waiting for you to do move to the next panel, which can work, but also I've run into some issues of this. There's this kind of uncanny valley feeling of when a character who was really active in real time just kind of pauses and waits for you to do the next action. I've had issues with that before, so that's why it would be tricky. But if you were doing an experience where the player were not in control of time, I think that becomes a lot easier, because it's less about making sure because the player can't rewind or go back. The dialogue becomes more precious and becomes more controlled. So you can play a lot with like if statements, which is something we actually didn't need much of around in Damien Phalion and the VR graphic novels. With this newer experience, this newer world-centric experience I'm developing, it's something I've had to play around with, because I've had to design character narratives, basically. Because let's say I need a character to go from point A to point B, I should design them in a way that they would only perform certain actions if like certain criteria has been met. For example, if I want a character to learn that there's been an accident nearby, right? That animation wouldn't play unless the player has seen that accident in the corner, right? So it becomes a situation where your narrative is beholden to whatever the player has seen, and then certain audio clips can't be played with that. It's like I said, it's a different. I wouldn't say one is harder than the other. I would just say it's a different suite of problems, because now you're trying to make sure, like, it depends on how much control an agency you want to give your players, because now you're trying to make sure, how do I deliver a compelling 3-act plot but where the pacing isn't in my control at all? Like, how do you still manage all those little things? It's a very different avenue, but I would say it's something that can work effectively if you can engage your viewer well enough. Because there's something that happens in a lot of games, especially open world games. This has been a trend that's been happening over the past few years. There's always one thing to distract you at all times. You're following one character. Let's say you're riding your horses in Red Dead Redemption, You're going in one direction, and suddenly there's a tiger mauling on some creature on the left. And it's interesting because it makes the world feel dynamic, but at the same time, it draws you away from what you were already doing, and that could break pacing. So there's things like that to kind of worry about when you start playing with real-time audio, especially what in an experience that's dictated by the player. So, like I said, that's a really good question. So there's no easy answer, but yeah, I think that's my best answer I can do.
Oh, that's a good answer. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Somebody has one.
Yeah, I was wondering if without VR, is there anywhere I could go and watch or walk through the Damien Fallion experience?
There's both we did translate the VR comic into a 2D comic, so there's that. I mean, there's also a 360 and 2D animated version of the experience, essentially, that I posted on YouTube. I will have a link to it on my website. I can probably.
I think you might want to check out your website. It seems to be having some troubles there.
Oh Lord, let's find out. I will.
But yeah, thank you for the presentation. It looks really beautiful, and I look forward to checking it out.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
And we're really excited to see what's next. So anytime you want to come back and present for us, we'd love to see more.
Thank you.
So thanks again, Ed.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much, man.
All right. All right. So yeah, maybe we'll just take a bit of a break, and then if people want to come and kind of share what they're working on, we'll kind of have a TAD talk afterwards. So we'll be back online in about 5 or 10 minutes. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Great.
Should I stop the live stream?
Yeah, probably.
Okay.
Yeah.